Good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your day to hang out with me and talk about screen making once again. This is my second installment of the live Q&A session, so I was happy to see a lot of people enjoyed it last time, and I want to continue doing these things while we're kind of stuck, not traveling and not getting out there and everything like that. So now's the time to answer any questions and kind of further education. So we can kind of begin. If you guys just want to lay out some of your questions in the live chat, I'll address them as they come in, and we'll kind of go from there. So Tim had asked here already, hey Kevin, can you go over what to look for when looking at the squares on the Chromaline exposure calculator? So the exposure calculator, this is what Tim is referring to right here. If you can kind of see that. It's our exposure calculator. It's a film. It's got a filter taped to it right here. And that filter, each one of those steps blocks a given amount of UV light. So what you do, and he's saying what to look for. What you're really looking for is the step that looks the cleanest and the sharpest. So here's an SEM photo of perfect mesh bridging. So you're looking for lines that are nice, sharp, and crisp lines like that. Whichever step looks the best, there's a little factor next to that. Just seeing here, it says I got some viewers. Yeah, here. I got M. Sullivan Photography. Can you talk about the best printer for printing positives? Yes. So for film positives, there's a few printers out there that I recommend. Currently on the smaller format side of things, we're selling a package that's the P400 printer. So that does up to 13 inches wide and takes a roll. So it's roll fed, up to 75-foot rolls that we manufacture for that printer specifically. We also do an all black ink set for that printer. And it works great with the Filmmaker RIP software. So that full package, we've got packaged on our website, and all of our distributors sell it as well. I think that's the best small format printer at the moment. Now, if you've got the budget and can go a little bit larger for a little bit better investment, the Epson T3270 can do up to 24 inches wide, but it's a far better, more industrial printer. It's going to last a lot longer. It's got much larger ink cartridges, so per milliliter of ink, you're actually spending quite a bit less. And it's just an overall better, well-built printer. So like I said, the ink is going to cost quite a bit less. The film is going to cost quite a bit less with that larger printer, but it is a much more expensive printer than the small P400. Epson 1430 was the predecessor before the P400, and that was a great printer. Everybody loved it, but Epson discontinued that printer, and now we're kind of stuck moving with Epson as they bring out new printers and discontinue some of the old printers. Yeah, good question. Tim, I hope that answered your question on the exposure calculator. But yeah, we can dive into that more if you've got more questions on that as well. I had a couple other questions that came in ahead of time. One of them was, what's the difference between a diazo emulsion and dual cure? So there's a misconception that those are the same thing because you're adding the diazo. So with a diazo emulsion, something like our CP Tex emulsion, you get this little bottle of diazo, and you'd fill it up with water to the shoulder. The diazo is just a powder in the bottom of this bottle. So you'd open it up, fill water up to the shoulder. A lot of people use distilled water, and that's great. You don't have to. Most people have good water nowadays, but If your water is questionable, you're living in the country or whatever the case is, and there's a lot of minerals in your water, using distilled would be better. So you just fill that bottle up to the shoulder right here with water, pour it into the bucket, and mix it. It's the exact same process for dual cure emulsions, so that's why people get them confused. A diazo emulsion, like our CP Tex, is just straight diazo. So what comes in the bucket itself isn't a sensitized emulsion. It's an unsensitized emulsion. When you add the diazo to it, that's when it is sensitized. For a dual cure emulsion, there's actually a pre-sensitized emulsion in that you're mixing with the diazo. So you actually have two curing systems. On top of that, they also asked, is it basically a pure photopolymer that you're adding diazo to? No, a dual cure isn't a pure photopolymer that you're adding diazo to. It will not work if you don't have the diazo added. So you need that mix of the diazo for that dual cure to work. It would not work. Even though there's a curing system in that bucket, it needs both of those curing systems to work properly. How long does CP Tex last after being mixed? So after it's mixed and sensitized, you've got about 4 to 6 weeks to use that product. Its diazo starts to age the second that it hits water. So once it's mixed, that diazo starts to age instantly, and you've got about 4 to 6 weeks. I typically lean towards that 4-week mark, because after that, you start to, if it's not stored properly, if it gets too hot, too cold, any of those options can really make it age faster. So I typically like to hit that 4-week mark. And when I mix dual cures or diazo-based emulsions, I always write right on the label when I mixed it, so I know exactly when did I mix it, how long do I have until it starts to lose its sensitivity. Now, I have had people use it, 6 weeks, even up to a couple months, and it does work sometimes depending on how it's stored, but you can't guarantee it. So you really want to use consistent procedures to have consistent results. He also asked, does putting the CP Tex in the fridge make it last longer? It can, because it keeps it cool. It can last longer. Heat makes diazo speed up the process of that aging process. So if you keep it in a refrigerator, it can last longer, typically more to that 6-week mark or maybe even 7 weeks. But the problem with that is when you take the emulsion out of your refrigerator into a warm environment, it starts to get condensation in that bucket because you're bringing it from cold to warm. Also, when it's cold like that in the refrigerator, the viscosity is changing as well. So now you need to wait till it brings up to room temperature. The best is to store it in, say, like an air-conditioned area. Room temperature is perfect. So if it's really hot in your shop, if you can keep the emulsion up near the office where it's air-conditioned, or in a different portion of the building where it is air-conditioned, away from the heat, that's going to be better. But yeah, in a refrigerator, it's kind of a catch-22. It does slow down that aging process, but can add other problems into your process. Buddy Herninson, I battle humidity each summer, and my film sometimes sticks to my screen. What causes that? So you've got a water-based product, which is emulsion, and you've got a water-based product, which is the ink that you're using on your films. Most of the time when humidity is present, it's telling me that the emulsion has not dried completely all the way through the screen. So if there's moisture present, and there's moisture present in the film, when they laminate it like that during the exposure process, the emulsion, being hygroscopic, wants to draw water into that screen. So if there's water in the ink or water in that film, what it does is it's just drawing that ink and the water from that ink right into that emulsion. So that's what's causing that lamination process. So one good thing, obviously, keep your environment environmentally controlled. Dehumidifiers are great. Air conditioners are great in the summer, but make sure everything is dry. One other thing too is if you're still fighting that and you're doing everything you can, we came out with the Chromaline emulsion, which is a pure photopolymer, and it has humidity resistance. So we've got videos on our website too that you can take a look at working with the Chromaline, but it's designed for humidity control and humidity resistance. That doesn't mean water resistant. humidity resistance and water resistance are two different things. But humidity resistance is just more of the environment and what that, how does that affect your screens? So we've tested it in a humidity chamber where it was 95, 98% humidity, where it's very, very humid, and taking screens out of there right into the exposure and the film comes right off, versus most other emulsions that are out there, or quite a few other emulsions that are out there, is going to kind of laminate if there's that humidity present. Yeah. So great questions, everybody. One other question that I had ahead of time is, why is it recommended not to use a metal ink spatula to sensitize emulsion? So you might hear that sometimes, and it's not necessarily the case. With a metal ink spatula, the biggest thing why I don't recommend that is because most of them have sharp edges. And if you're mixing your emulsion with a spatula that has a really sharp edge, if you were to scrape the inside of that plastic bucket, you could actually scrape some shavings of that plastic into that emulsion, contaminating that emulsion. But if you're using a stainless steel metal spatula, that's perfectly fine. Stainless steel is fine. But some of the other metals that are out there, iron, copper, brass, can have negative effects and can react with that emulsion. But stainless steel is what we mix our emulsion in our facility. So stainless steel isn't going to react with it. But if the edges are sharp, you can have that contamination issue where you're scraping on the inside of that bucket. But to avoid all things like that, I always recommend using these wooden paint stirrers like these. You can get real aggressive with it. And if you're not going to scrape any plastic off on the inside of the bucket, it's not going to react with the emulsion. So that's kind of what I recommend going with. How can I tell if my screen is underexposed? A telltale sign for underexposure is when you're developing your screen. If you would feel the inside of that screen and it feels slimy on the inside, so here's the outside of the screen that your film would be on. When you're washing your screen out, screens are exposed linearly. So as it's in there longer, the UV light is passing through that screen. The longer it's in there, the longer it passes all the way through. That's why it needs to have a specific time for your exposure time to make sure it gets all the way through that emulsion. If when you're washing your screen out, if you feel the inside of that screen and it feels slimy or color comes off on your hand, it's telling you that the inside of that screen has not been fully exposed. So it hasn't been cured all the way through and it needs to have more time added. So that's a great telltale sign of underexposure. Also, if your screens are delaminating, if when you wash it off, you've got emulsion that's pulling away, or when you're printing, emulsion's pulling away, most likely it's underexposed as well. Tim, if you need to add diazo to a dual cure, why not use a diazo emulsion? Okay, great question. So the biggest difference between a diazo emulsion and a dual cure emulsion, I was kind of going down that path before, but a diazo emulsion can only be resistant to water or solvents, but it cannot be resistant to both. Where just based on how we have the ratios of the PDA, PDAC that gets mixed into that diazo emulsion, we can make it really water resistant or make it very solvent resistant, but you can't make it both. With a dual cure, the emulsion that is in the bucket itself could be designed to, work with one curing system, or the other, the diazo, works with water-based. And those two curing systems, how it mixes together, can make it so it's resistant to solvents and water. So it's more of a good universal type of emulsion using a dual cure versus diazo-based. So it really goes back to the systems that you're printing with. Excuse me. But yeah, that's the biggest thing between those. So with a diazo-based emulsion, it's gonna work with only one type of ink system. And keep in mind, any emulsion that's out there is going to work with plastisol inks. Plastisol is non-evasive, so it's going to work perfectly fine with that. Excuse me. Can you explain what happens when adding too much water to the diazo and not adding enough water? Yeah, so I mean, it doesn't necessarily affect the water. How we develop the emulsion is designed to have a specific amount of water to have the viscosity that we're really shooting for. So it will change your viscosity. I have had customers thin out their emulsion because they will add a little bit more water, and it'll still work, but it's not exactly the specifications, sorry, that we have listed for that particular emulsion. So the viscosity, exposure times, solid content, all of those stats are really based on having the correct amount of water. So you can change your viscosity, but it will change other things in your process as well. It's going to change the solid content and everything that goes along with that. So it's always recommended to use the same amount of water that we recommend, because those are the specifications that we have for that particular product. Also, if you don't have enough water in that emulsion, a lot of times that diazo doesn't disperse properly throughout the entire bucket. And if it doesn't disperse properly all the way through that emulsion, then you're going to have fluctuating exposure times throughout that bucket as you do, your 80 screens out of that bucket, or however many you get out of that one bucket, depending on how thick you coat your screens. Some are going to have different thicknesses, and it's going to have different exposure times. Michelle, what are your thoughts on the different types of exposure units? What's the best? Okay, yeah, so there's quite a few different exposure units out there. There's LED. That's kind of the rage right now. Everybody is talking about LED. There's metal halide. There's fluorescent tube units. There's there's halogen bulbs. There's all different types of exposure units out there. If you want to have the best quality screens, the best quality screens are going to come from a metal halide system. So a single point metal halide system. So what that means by single point is there's one bulb, and all of that light is coming from one light source. So it's all coming in one direction straight. Whereas LED systems, fluorescent tube systems, there's many bulbs in there. So that light kind of crosses each other, and that can lead to undercutting. And if you were to look at each one of your dots under magnification, sometimes you have haloing around those dots, and it's not as crisp and sharp of resolution and crisp of edges that you're getting with your screens. So a single point system is always going to give you the best screens that you can have, as well as the spectral range of that light source of metal halide much closer resembles the spectral appetite of emulsion. So it's just a better fit between metal halide and emulsion, where LED kind of peaks at the wrong point, peaks a little higher, so it doesn't fully get a perfectly solid cure. It's a little bit more of a soft exposure with LED. Good questions, guys. Thanks. Yeah, I had one other question that came in before. What's the recommended shelf life for photopolymer versus dual cure? We kind of got into that before. When a dual cure or diazo-based emulsion is mixed, you've got that 4 to 6 week window to use it. Before it's mixed, you've got 12 months to use that emulsion. Whereas a pure photopolymer, being a single part emulsion that you're not adding diazo to, it's got about a 2-year shelf life. So much longer shelf life for those pure photopolymers. What are your recommendations for using capillary film versus direct emulsion? Yeah, so capillary film versus direct emulsion. Capillary film is just going to give you a much more consistent coat all the time. So I wouldn't necessarily say you have to use one or the other. At the end of the day, both are going to make a screen for you, especially in the textile industry. But with capillary film, like our quick film here, which I also have a video posted, you can take a look at that application process. It's a very simple process, but every single screen that you coat with quick film or any of our capillary films are going to be extremely consistent. The thickness is always the same because it's industrial coated, so it's +1, -1 micron. We've got a very consistent process on coating that. Whereas, I mean, I've been coating screens for 20 years, and I'm pretty darn good at hand coating screens, but I can't coat screens down to +1, -1 micron. So if you have an auto coater with direct emulsion, you can coat your screens down to that very consistent process. So if you're using direct emulsion with an auto coater, you can get it extremely close to capillary film. But once again, there is nothing that's going to beat the consistency of capillary film. If you're doing water-based or discharge printing, that's the biggest downside for capillary film. There isn't a capillary film on Earth that's going to work with water-based or discharge inks because just how it needs to be formulated, how it works, applying this with water to your screen. You just use water to apply the capillary film to your screen. If it were to be resistant to water, it just wouldn't use that capillary action and actually draw into that screen. So there just isn't one that's going to work with water-based or discharge. But it is going to be far more consistent and less waste with capillary film. But it is a little bit more expensive per sheet, per screen, but there is less waste. So there are things that kind of counter effect itself out. The consistency that it brings also can definitely help with the cost justification of the capillary film as well. Buddy Hermanson, I use capillary film. Is there some kind of solution I can use to reduce dry spots? Also, can you suggest the best cleaner for haziness? Yeah, so I mean, you just want to make sure that your screens are really degreased well. I've got Chromaline. That's what I typically use for degreasing all my screens. But if there's a few different ways of applying capillary film. The traditional method would be where you'd wet your screen down, you'd roll down the capillary film onto that screen where the screen is really wet. So one good thing is we've got a product called Chroma-Wet. It's a wetting agent. It makes things, it changes the surface property of the mesh, so it takes more water. So if you were to wet your screen down without something like Chroma-Wet, you're going to see streaks of the water coming down. If you were to use Chroma-Wet and wet your screen down, you're going to see a nice sheet of water hold on that screen, and it's going to make that capillary film actually suck into the mesh much more evenly. But the method that I use, you don't have to use any chemicals like that. You don't have to use our Chroma-Wet. I use a dry process with a spray gun, similar to something like this. I used to use this pressure spray gun filled with just water. But like I said, I've got a video on here as well. Take a look at that, and you can see exactly the process that I use, and that is a very simple process without other chemicals that some other people do use. What's your advice on coating methods for beginners and those a little bit more advanced? I know it matters about the inks and the artwork. Yeah, it matters not so much about the inks and the artwork. It does a little bit, but it matters more about the types of the mesh counts that you're using, and it matters about the emulsion that you're using. Because if you've got a higher solids emulsion, if you just coat that 1-in-1, so say something like our Chroma Blue, which is 50% solids, if you coat that 1-in-1 when the screen is drying, that means half of that bucket of emulsion is, so 50% solids, 50% water. So when the screen is drying, 50% of that, what you put on that screen, is going to evaporate away. If you've got an emulsion that's, say, 20% solids, that means 80% of what you put on that screen is going to evaporate away. So if you're using something higher in solids, a 1-in-1 coat might get you that 10 to 20% EOM thickness range that you're really shooting for. But if you've got a lower solids emulsion, you might have to coat that 2-in-2 to get that same thickness. So it's more along the lines of that. Also, if you're using higher mesh counts with a high solids emulsion, you don't want to have too thick of a stencil because you're trying to resolve something that's very fine. So don't have something that's a very thick stencil when you're trying to resolve very fine details. Can you discuss the capillary film that has a better stencil surface RZ than even machine-coated direct emulsion? I mean, honestly, that's every capillary film. Every capillary film is going to have a better Stencil surface RZ than machine-coated emulsions, because we're using an industrial coater. Our industrial coaters are much more consistent than any of the auto coaters that you can get in a shop. So we can really dial in that system. So any of the capillary films that are out there are going to have a better RZ. And when they're asking about RZ, RZ stands for the roughness, or if you were to actually measure the roughness or smoothness of that emulsion, the lower the RZ is going to be, the smoother that coat is on that screen, which can give you much better resolution. So if you've got people, say, in like the electronics industry, or where the tolerances are much tighter, you're going to want to have a much lower RZ. What are the advantages of making positives using an inkjet printer versus laser printers? Yeah, so laser printers isn't inkjet film. Laser printer is vellum. So with vellum, if you were to actually measure the clear area and measure the dark printed area on a vellum, those numbers are going to be very close to each other. So with vellum, you're always going to be underexposing your screens. They work. It's cheap. There's a lot of people that use it, but it is a much cheaper process for a reason. You're always going to have underexposed screens. Vellum is a hot process, so it shrinks and expands as it goes through that printer. So not every one of those vellums are going to line up perfectly. And if they don't line up perfectly, your screens are never going to line up perfectly. So you're going to have a lot of problems on press trying to do registration. The other thing is with film, it's a cold process, so it doesn't shrink and expand. It's a much clearer film, so your exposure times can be much lower and get a much better burn on your screen, a much more thorough burn on your screen. So a fully exposed screen is going to come from something like inkjet film versus vellum, as well as registration issues are next to none with inkjet film as well, because it's a stable cold process. Great. These are good questions, everybody. Yeah, I just wanted to, get information out there, because I really want to be out there working with my customers, but unfortunately I can't at the moment. Hopefully I can soon, but this is the best way that I can get out to all of your shops right now and keep everybody safe. So again, another question here. I tried printing out a positive and it's not very dense. Any ideas? That can be from a magnitude of different problems. It could go down to the printer that you're using, the ink that you're using. So there's a couple different inks. So with Epson printers, which is what pretty much everybody uses now, they're the best heads. They print the best for films. But Epson standard inks are pigment-based inks, and they're more transparent than, say, some of the inks like what we have. We've got a third-party ink. It's a dye-based ink that is a much more opaque, darker ink. So you can get much blacker, darker prints with a dye-based ink versus what's typically in an Epson printer right out of a box. Now, the other thing is RIP software. RIP software is basically going to be the brains of that printer. It's going to dictate how much ink is laid down on that film, and your line counts, your angles of your dots, the dot structure, all of that is going to come from that RIP software. So you can really adjust how much ink is laid down with RIP software. So you can print down nice dark prints versus just trying to print it out of Photoshop through your standard print driver. Your chances are, you've got a few different options that you can choose from, but you're just never going to get it dark enough to be able to print good, rich, black, opaque positives that you can with the proper software, RIP software. And I typically recommend the CAD-Link software. That's what works for the smaller printers like the P400, the 1430s, all the way up to the T3270s, and even larger yet. It's a great, easy to use software, and you can have quite a bit of control over your process with that RIP software. The only downside is you can't install it on a Mac. So there are ways around that. If you've got a PC station that you can run it on, you can run your Macs through that PC fairly easily through networking. But that's the only downside, is it cannot be installed on a Mac. But yeah, hopefully that answers that question. Let's see here. I had another question. No, answered that one before as well. Yeah. What's so important about solids content in emulsion, and how does it help me? Yeah, so I kind of talked about that a little bit already. So where you've got a screen, so say you've got an emulsion like Chroma Blue, which is 50% solids. That means the other 50% in that bucket is water. So if you coat your screen, 50% of that is gonna evaporate away. So you can use a 1-in-1 coat and get the stencil build that you're after. Whereas if you're using something much lower in solids, more of that emulsion is going to evaporate away during the drying process. So you're going to have a much thinner stencil, which means you have to have more passes, more coats on that screen to get the EOM that you're trying to achieve. So basically, you need to use more emulsion. So if you're using Chroma Blue, I did a case study at one point in time, and we did, I forget what the actual numbers were right off the top of my head, but we did 1-in-1 coating where we had to do a 2-in-1 coating with another emulsion, a competitor's emulsion, to get the same EOM, the same thickness. So now, not only are you using more manufacturing time, but if you're hand coating your screens, your arm is going to be a lot more tired at the end of coating, 80 screens versus 1-in-1 versus a 3-in-1. You're adding 30% more passes to your screen, and you're putting 30% more emulsion on the screen just to achieve the same stencil thickness. So not all emulsions are considered equal, especially, if you look at a bucket, one bucket costs you $65, and you look at another one and that one costs $60. Well, just to say, I'm going to buy this one because it's $5 less, it's saving me $5 less a gallon, you might get 20 to 30 less screens out of that bucket because it's lower in solids. So there's things that you have to really factor into it. You have to factor in all those factors, which really are going to play into what the cost of that emulsion really is. There's a reason why some emulsions are more expensive than others. It could be the particle size. We've got emulsions in our electronics industry, which we can resolve lines down to 15 micron lines. A red blood cell is 8 microns wide, but we're resolving lines that are down to 15 microns wide, which is crazy. But you have to use a much smaller particle size, and because of that, it's a more expensive emulsion. You would never use that in the textile industry because you're talking over $100 a gallon versus $60 to $70 a gallon in a lot of cases, or even less. But yeah, that's a great question. But yeah, it really factors in, and most people don't think of all of those things. But the solid content is one thing that emulsion reps are always talking about, and most people don't really understand how that really correlates back to their process. What does that mean for them? But that's the biggest thing, is you're going to get more screens out of a bucket because you can coat with less passes, less time, so more throughput, more screens faster through your screen room. Quick turn times, all of that goes along with it. So you might spend $5 more for a higher solids emulsion, but really it might actually be saving you money in the long run versus something that's lower in solids. Yeah. Yeah, these are great questions today, guys. I'm going to continue to do these, probably, maybe once a week, maybe every other week, but I'll put it out there. So I recommend subscribing to this channel so you always get notifications and seeing when things are posted, because I'm doing different technical videos too. Like I said, I did one on capillary film. I'm going to be doing one as well on printing positives with I've got a 1430 Epson printer here. So I'm going to go through that process in another technical video here soon. So yeah, keep an eye on this YouTube channel and when I'm posting more things as well. Can dual cure emulsion break down with water-based ink? Really that goes down to what the emulsion is. So some dual cures are going to be more water resistant than other dual cures. Just because it is a dual cure doesn't mean that it's extremely water resistant. That's one of those things on a more of a one-on-one basis. Talk with your emulsion reps like myself and we can kind of dial in the specific emulsion that's perfect for your system and what you're doing. But some dual cures are going to be more water resistant than others. Darren, what are your thoughts on drying cabinets? Necessary expense or mere luxury? Yeah, it really goes back to the environment. Drying cabinets are, in my opinion, I think not just a luxury. I think it's going to make sure that your screens are thoroughly dry all the way through. The biggest thing is a lot of people, you can feel your screen. It's going to be skimmed over. It feels dry to the touch, but in the inside of that emulsion, it might still be wet. So if it isn't dry thoroughly all the way through that screen, it's going to act underexposed when you go to shoot it and when you go to use it on press. So it's better to know that your screens are thoroughly dry all the way through those screens. But you want to make sure, there's people that do DIY exposure, not exposure, drying cabinets. And the biggest thing is you want to have good airflow. So you want to have it dark. You want it to be as dark as possible, 100% darkness inside that drying cabinet, but you want to have airflow as well. A lot of people will have a drying cabinet where it's perfectly sealed up, that they DIY themselves, and it's sealed up so there's no place for the water to go when those screens are drying. So the water goes into the air and it just re-wets those screens. So it's a constant cycle of evaporating and then going right back into the emulsion. So it's never going to be thoroughly dry. Another thing people do with DIY drying cabinets is they've got a heater in there and they crank that thing way up and it gets really hot in there, and the heat can actually damage your emulsion as well. So you want to make sure inside that drying cabinet you keep it under 105 degrees is what I typically recommend it at. But if you get a drying cabinet that's manufactured specifically for that, it's going to dry your screens much more thoroughly, much more complete. And that's gonna help, especially if you're printing something like water-based or discharge. You want to make sure those screens are 100% dry. There's tools out there. This is the one that I use and recommend. This is the CFAR HumiCheck. So you would actually put this right on your screen, and it will measure if your screen is dry. It'll tell you if there's still moisture present. But it's a flat probe versus what some people use, those wood humidity check units. If you go to like Home Depot or something like that, and they've got two prongs that you would put on there, and usually they're really sharp. So a lot of times people pop their screens when they're using systems like those. But this one here, this moisture meter, you just lay on your screen. It tells you how much moisture is in your screen, and I think it's a really good practice to have. But yeah, those drying cabinets are going to really make your screens and your process more consistent. David, we do discharge printing, invariably have stencil breakdown. We have used CP-Tex before and still have had issues. Do you feel this is because of underexposure? We have an eye image and a starlight. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, LED exposure units, like a starlight is, doesn't give you a really solid burn. And we've got our own LED exposure unit, but it's just not the same kind of quality and the same kind of burn that you can get with a metal halide system. The other thing is, yeah, it could be underexposure. Definitely underexposure is going to make sure that your screens break down. And with water-based and discharge, when I talk about exposure times, there's a window of exposure latitude. So you can be over that perfect time a little bit. You could be under that time, and you still fall within that window. But if you're doing water-based and discharge, you want to be on the high side of that exposure latitude every single time. The longer that it's exposed, the more cross-linking is taking place, which means that it's going to be a more durable, more water-resistant emulsion. So you could be slightly underexposed, and that could be causing it. It could be the fact that you're using LED system. It could be any of those factors. But say with LED matches up more with a pure photopolymer much better. So you might have more success with a pure photopolymer like our Chromatech WR that we have, or our DTS Z1. Both of those are pure photopolymers that are very water resistant, but because of the spectral appetite of a pure photopolymer much closely resembling the output of an LED exposure unit, you're going to have a much better burn with LED with a pure photopolymer. So that might be a better option for you as well. But yeah, it could definitely be underexposure. If any screens are underexposed, it could go back to what I was saying before that as well, with screens not being thoroughly dry too. So if your screens aren't thoroughly dry, especially for water-based and discharge, water-based and discharge are extremely aggressive inks towards that emulsion, even more than solvent-based inks. So with that in mind, screens have to be, you have to have every step of that process perfect. So the screens need to be thoroughly dry, the proper exposure time, which on the high side of your exposure time. But then once again, the right emulsion for your process. And CP Techs, I've had customers do 75,000 impressions with zero breakdown with water-based and discharge inks, but those screens are perfectly dry. They're using a metal halide exposure unit, just the perfect system. When you start adding some of those other units, which aren't exactly perfect for that system, then you start to run into some of those other issues where you have to compensate from another thing as well. So David, I would recommend for your system that you try something like the Chromatech WR or our DTS C1. One of those would be most likely a better solution for you. And to be fair, currently right now I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but we're working on a new pure photopolymer emulsion at the moment that is looking extremely promising in testing already, and it's extremely water resistant. So I'm pretty excited to have that one in my arsenal. So keep an eye out for that one as well going forward. But yeah, great question, David. Let's see here. So if anybody has any more questions, I'd be happy to answer those. Like I said, keep an eye out for more technical videos. I'm going to keep doing these live Q&As. And if you've got questions, I'll put in my email address into the chat as well. You can always email me there, questions that you have, and I can address those. Like I said, I had a few questions that came in ahead of this as well, and when I do these live Q&As, then I can always address any questions that you have. You might think of something, tomorrow and go, shoot, I should have asked that. Feel free to shoot me an email anytime, and I'll just put that in my checklist for the next Q&A that I do to make sure I address it first and foremost. Or if it's something that I can do a technical video right here, if you've got ideas that you want to see technical videos done, I'd be happy to do anything like that. Best binge-worthy series staying at home. All you cool cats and kittens, I got to say the Tiger King is pretty fantastic. A little controversial. I don't know which side I stand on, but it's a pretty entertaining series so far. So yeah, good question. Not so much screen related, but I'll be happy to answer any questions that come through here to the best of my ability. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed Tiger King. Thanks, Dan. Appreciate the humor. David, which of your emulsions are best for 55 line dots on a 305 mesh? All right, so that's on the higher side. So a 305 mesh, I typically am going to recommend dual cures for the finer detailed things that are out there. If you're using something that's high in solids, that's going to give you a little bit thicker of a stencil build. And dual cures typically have a more fine particle size in it as well. So you can resolve finer details with dual cures than you can with a lot of the pure photopolymers that are out there. Not all of them, but most times I would lean towards a dual cure. So something like 305 mesh and a 55 line, something like our UDC HV, UDC2, UDC ACE, one of those emulsions being a dual cure would be give you a much better resolution for the artwork that you're trying to reproduce. But a 55 line, I've got people doing 55 line all day long, with Chroma Blue, Chroma Lime, and any of the emulsions that we're doing. But if you're doing the 305 mesh, chances are the reason you're using a 305 mesh is because you're trying to resolve really small dots or lines, or their artwork has features in it that are extremely fine. And that's the reason why you're using those higher mesh counts. Keep in mind, a good rule of thumb is the width of 2 threads in a mesh opening. So once again, I'll grab that photo I had out here. So the width of 2 threads in a mesh opening is the smallest printable dot that you can print with a specific mesh count. So if your dot is smaller than that, lands right on a thread or lands on one mesh opening in a thread, you might have to go to a higher mesh count to put more threads per inch in there. But really, that's what's going to dictate the mesh count that you're using is your artwork. And the best way that I like to do it is I'll take your artwork. This is my exposure calculator, but whatever artwork that you have, look for the smallest features, the smallest dots, smallest lines. Put it right on a screen that isn't exposed. And then with a loop, put it right on there and take a look. See, is the smallest dot, does that cover 2 threads in a mesh opening? If it doesn't, you're going to have to go up in mesh count to the point where it at least is going to cover those 2 threads in a mesh opening. It needs to have those anchors. We can resolve those finer dots on there, but they're not going to hold. So you're going to have dot gain, dot loss in your highlights and your shadow areas if you're not using the right mesh counts. But yeah, I typically, in the higher resolution artwork, I like dual cures. But once again, you can't just say one thing is going to work for everything. That's just not the way this industry works, unfortunately. So if you're using LED exposure units, I would recommend a pure photopolymer once again. But once again, it goes back to your specific system and the artwork that you're doing to really answer that question properly. But like I said, a dual cure, you can resolve much finer detail than you can with a pure photopolymer in most cases. Great. So yeah, if everybody is good on questions for the day, I'll give it another few seconds here and see if any more come in. But if not, like I said, keep an eye out. I'll keep doing these. As long as you're watching them, I'll keep doing them. And honestly, I think even when we get back to normal, whatever normal really ends up being, I kind of plan on doing more of this going forward, even when I'm able to get out there and see you guys live and in person, which I am definitely starving for. I want to get out and see people. Did a conference call with the Apparel Decorators Committee yesterday for SGIA that I sit on, and it was just good seeing people. So, and that's just on the computer, and that felt good. But I really can't wait to get out and work with all of you guys in your shops. We're going to be hitting the streets hard when they open the floodgates. But yeah, I do plan on doing more of this even going forward. So it looks like they're slowing down on question wise. My puppy, yeah. We just got a new puppy. She's a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. Her name is Reese because she's black and tan. She looks like a Reese's peanut butter cup. She's 8 weeks old, so I've got cuts on my fingers and toes and everything that she likes to bite at the moment. But she's only 8 weeks old, so she's cute as hell. But it's been tiring getting about 2 hours of sleep in the last 72 hours. So I'm just happy that I'm still standing at this point. But thanks, I appreciate it. She's been fun. Puppies are awesome, and it's a good time. It's a good time to get a puppy because hanging around, having time in the office is definitely a good time for training. All right, guys. And if that's the case, I'll wrap it up here. Like I said, keep an eye out, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks.